So, going back a little bit in terms of archaic Homo, again, really kind of 3.3 is Homo habilis. And when we get into, again, the reason why they say archaic Homo is we're getting into possibly from Homo habilis to Neanderthal or even like Cro-Magnon man. Homo habilis found a lot of evidence in Olduvai Gorge, Tanzania. The Leakeys discovered the fossils and stone tools, and this is what we call the Oldowan tradition. Homo erectus, again, got out to Asia, Indonesia, all those other places. Much taller. Homo erectus average height was 6 feet. And I find Homo erectus very, very fascinating in terms of the longevity of the species. And their stone tool tradition is called the Acheulean tradition. And they made these very large hand axes out of stone, finely crafted. Archaic Homo, one of the theories is that they start to follow meat out of Africa. And this would be erectus. Homo habilis does not get out. Erectus becomes very, very addicted to red meat. And this is obviously going to be after they start hunting, because prior to that, they would have just hung around and scavenged. Homo floresiensis, talked about that one already. Homo neanderthalensis is probably the most well-known hominid relative. And ultimately in Europe and kind of West Asia, I guess, is the furthest that they get. They are, again, very large, big head in terms of brain case, strong, lots of muscle. It looks like they were also addicted to kind of the big game, mammoth and bison and whatnot. And they are, the Maustrian tradition is considered the stone toolkit of the Neanderthal. All right, modern humans, we're talking 200 to 300,000 years ago. The lower Paleolithic is what we call it. That's the stone tools that include ancient Homo habilis all the way up through kind of the beginning of humans stone tool. And then we get the middle Paleolithic. And then the upper Paleolithic is really what we focus on, which is stone tool technology from 45,000 to 12,000 years ago. Cro-Magnon, 40,000 years ago in Europe, more sophisticated stone tools, and cave art becomes a thing. So this is when cave art becomes very important in terms of symbolic meaning for humans. We also get around 40,000, 50,000, we get also very interesting music equipment and instruments, flutes, and some of these other things that are super, super interesting. Moving on through kind of the time, the big debate, obviously, in philosophy gets into Hobbes versus Rousseau, and we'll talk about that. Hobbes, 1600 philosopher, believes that all humans are innately bad creatures, okay, and that we need a hierarchy of power to keep us in check. And again, love the monarchy. Now, Hobbes has some interesting things to say. However, Hobbes was ignorant on the fact that humans had actually lived in peace for a long, long part of our history, like 200,000 years worth. And we'll talk about his critiquer now. Rousseau is a 1700s Enlightenment philosopher, wrote The Social Contract, believed that humans are all naturally good and that society corrupts them. He believed that people should kind of decide on government. Now, here's the interesting piece, right? Both are wrong in terms of putting a Western binary, which is good, bad, black, white, night, day. A lot of times this is how we learn when we're children, right? No, yes, these are binary structures. They're not gray area conversations. Hobbes believing that we're all born bad and Rousseau believing that we're born good are some interesting kind of concepts. I would say that we fall more on the spectrum of Rousseau, which is we actually are born, humans are born with a cooperative gene. And I think one of the questions that I ask you on your guided lesson is about bonobos. Bonobos do not hunt, and they might eat a little meat, but they share. They're the ape that makes love, not war. So if somebody new comes into their group, they basically have sex with them and not fight and kill them off like the chimps do, which are their closest relatives. So some interesting things. It tends to look like, the chimps have this need for a powerful leader, and the bonobos tend to cooperate, and females have more more power within that structure of their kind of culture group. And bonobos tend to fall on the more Rousseauian side. Now, the way that we're taught history is that humans fall on the Hobbes side, where we're all just brutes and want to kill each other and go to war and all of these other things. Nothing can be further from the truth, actually. And I'll get into evidence of war and violence towards the end of this presentation. Rousseau tends to be more right in terms of good. What I mean by good is that we tend to have an altruistic gene in us and also a cooperative gene, which is a trusting gene. We also tend to be different than some of the other ape species in that we are able to learn and teach each other in a cooperative way. It's not through force. It doesn't have to be through force. This is exactly what I'm doing right now when kind of explaining some of these ideas to you. You're on the other side of a computer kind of listening, and this is very different than a chimp or a gorilla teaching their young how to behave or how to interact. So Rousseau tends to be more on the right side. Being born kind of a blank slate is true, right? So neutral society can corrupt. If you have a society who believes in cannibalism, then you're ultimately going to grow up thinking that cannibalism is the right thing to do. This is the power of culture. However, again, I tend to side with Rousseau on the idea that people are more born on that spectrum and they're more born on the good side because they're born with this cooperative gene. And we've done a bunch of infant studies, and it shows that humans are actually much more cooperative and trusting in terms of infants. And this is true when infants first kind of can start to see. Their whole goal is to figure out who they can trust and why, and start to form that bond. And this is why you start to get when if an adult smiles at a very young infant, they'll start to smile back, and it's one of the first kind of signs of trust. So these are some interesting things that don't necessarily happen in the ape world. Again, egalitarianism. Egalitarian is an important term for you. This is basically equality of status. Nobody has one status that is higher ranked than others. In terms of how long human beings operated like this, we're talking 300,000 years ago, up to 12,000 years ago, which you should notice is kind of the birth of civilization. We have Göbekli Tepe and some of these other places, which you start to get a hierarchy. When you build buildings and cities, you tend to get leadership and you get workers and all of these other things. And we'll go into what civilization looks like in a second. So egalitarian means equal, no division of status, or all of labor and social activities are given equal value and status. So if I'm a hunter, right, as part of the tribe, then equal status is given to somebody who goes and gathers berries, because both are important. In fact, I would argue that the berries are actually more beneficial to you than hunting in terms of health. So despite differences like task, gender, and age, obviously kids, once you become an adult, you're going to be given that same status. So this is a very important piece in terms of anthropological thought, and the reason why we see that egalitarianism pretty much is the way is that up till 12,000 years ago, the planet was, I guess, not as forgiving in terms of food and ability to grow food, and agriculture wasn't necessarily needed. So if you don't have that structure and you don't need to plan and time things around that, and the earth is kind of just providing, and you're working as a group to survive, then egalitarianism really works out. I consider myself an egalitarian anthropologist, which is, I think in the current age, it's not necessarily impossible to create kind of this equal status. I don't know that we need to go to this Hobbesian view of having some leadership. And I would give the example of direct democracy as being that value. When we all show up to vote, we're given equal status in that moment. In California, I'm talking about when we vote on the propositions. That's kind of a version of moving back towards egalitarianism, and we'll get into long discussions about this as well. Division of labor is based on talent. So if you're good at hunting, you're going to be promoted as a good hunter, and you're going to get some prestige with that. If you're not good at hunting, the tribe would not let you go hunt all the time. And it doesn't make sense, right? You would have been, and in this case, you tend to, you either get promoted with positive reinforcement, or you get kind of moved into a new role based on ridicule and mocking, right? So social check, prestige, people kind of getting a big head. If I'm a good hunter and I come back and I start to brag, the whole group will start to make fun of me. And it's through ridicule and mocking that we keep people in check. And we do this today. Again, some versions of it are just your friend group where everybody kind of, if somebody gets too big of a head, you start to make fun of them, and then it kind of equals things out. This is in us, and it has been in us for a very, very long time. Symbolic and ritual war. This is fascinating as well. We don't have evidence of war prior to that 12,000 BCE kind of mark either. What we did have was what was called symbolic war, where groups would line up on each side. They'd pick one fighter or hunter to come out, and then the lines would shoot arrows at that one person. Once the one person on either side was injured, it stopped the war, and the chiefs would do a negotiation. This is very common in the Bay Area, California group. It's found all over the world. But again, it's all about less casualties. It's about symbolically fixing a wrong. And it has very little to do with total annihilation. Our version of war is very different than how groups of people did it in the past. Reasons for symbolic war, again, is minimize casualties. You may need to trade, or you may need to actually even interbreed with the group that's next to you. So going out all out war in this time period when there's less than 1 million people on the planet doesn't really make sense. And again, it was used all over the world prior to agriculture and colonial contact. The view of history and what history gives us is that ultimately human beings are this Hobbesian version of always fighting and always violent for the last 300,000 years. That whole savage idea of everyone just going around killing each other, and the natives did it too. And no, actually, what we find is that it is colonial and very much a civilization issue. War tends to be something that when we get Egypt and Mesopotamia and some of these other places, they start to create standing armies with division of labor. Next thing you know, they want to conquer each other. They want to bring back their gold. This never happened prior to that because we had enough resources and we just lived on the land. County coup among the Plains Indians. This is a picture of that. Many people think that the Plains Indians were quite brutal and just would kill everyone. And again, the horse changed a lot of kind of the lifestyle of the Plains Indians. However, county coup was fascinating. And the Americans, when they kind of got off the plains, were scratching their heads over this. In battle, different tribes would, if they could touch an enemy with a coup stick in battle, that was more prestigious than killing an enemy. And this is a form of symbolic war as well. And then they'd get back to their the village, and they would have a coup stick, a large pole where they would hit on the pole how many times they actually touched the enemy. And this would basically be prestige points that they were going after. And again, for me, the question moving forward is, why does this kind of practice make sense? And the idea that we talk about world peace as this unattainable kind of ideal. But in reality, we did have world peace. We just moved towards this structure of zero-sum game, and I'm going to take what's mine and whatever that means. And it doesn't matter if I conquer groups of people or go to war with them or take them out. It's all about us and the in-group kind of mentality. So so-called civilization is born. We get agriculture. It's formed out of horticulture. Horticulture, again, is small gardens. Before that, it was basically human beings kind of tending to the environment, whether it be lighting it on fire so that it becomes more fertile. Up in the Bay Area, they did this a lot. Foraging, right? Blackberries or black raspberries were here. You would just forage those. Same with acorns, same with pinion nuts. All of those things were kind of here. Agriculture creates a dependency and labor debt in order to satisfy the number one basic need. Okay, so this is a big kind of point that causes some contention as well.